Hi, I'm Jennifer Hermes Nastu, Content Director for Energy and Environment Leader, and I want to thank you for joining today's E&E Leader webinar. The webinar is sponsored by Intellects Technologies, Pure Strategies, and Sphera, and I'm excited to welcome our speakers who are top experts at these companies, along with an environmental impact specialist from 7th Generation. I will introduce them in just a minute, but first I wanted to thank everyone who's joining us live and to extend a large thank you in advance to folks who will be joining or who will be watching this on demand. We appreciate everyone joining us. As you know, today's webinar is about supply chain and scope 3 emissions and how to manage these complex elements of an organization's sustainability strategy. As we all know, the supply chain has become a vital and ever more visible element of commercial and industrial sustainability goals, and particularly in light of the fact that value chain emissions often represent the majority of an organization's total GHG emissions. So to discuss these realities and the steps companies can take to improve supply chain emissions, I am thrilled to be joined by Sonny Smith, VP of EH&S, Tim Greiner, Managing Director with Pure Strategies, Ashley Ordin, Chief Impact Officer with 7th Generation, Trevor Bronson, Strategic Development Manager with Intellects, and Graham Freeman, who is the Senior Content Manager at Intellects. So welcome everyone. I'm really excited to have you all here. And Tim, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Good. Okay. So yeah, welcome everyone. And I would love to have you all give our viewers just a minute or two of an introduction of yourself, who you are, and what your company is. So Sonny, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sonny Smith. I look after Sphera's EH&S area across EMEA and APAC. For those of you who don't know, Sphera is a leading ESG software services and data business, headquartered out of Chicago, but I'm based in the UK. We've got global operations. My background and kind of interest in Scope 3. Scope 3 is one of my favorite topics. So I've been working in sustainability over the past 20 years. I started off in product sustainability and had the privilege of writing what I believe is still, was the world's first product carbon footprinting standard past 2050, and then moved into the corporate sustainability space with Sphera advising multinationals on their ESG strategies. And for me, that Scope 3 is that nice balance of my product sustainability experience coming back into the corporate side of it. And that merging of the two, I think, is where I think we're quite interested to talk today about.
Great, thank you and welcome. Tim, how about you? Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Pure Strategies?
Yes, thanks, Jennifer. My name's Tim Greiner, and I'm the Managing Director at Pure Strategies. We're a sustainability consulting company that helps brands, retailers, and manufacturers on their sustainability journey. So that includes setting corporate strategy for companies who are new to the sustainability space, as well as revising existing strategies or digging deeper in specific areas. And one of those areas that has come up a lot in the last couple of years has been greenhouse gases and science-based targets. And in that area, we help companies learn about or dive into their supply chains, develop emission inventories, set targets, and also implement interventions. So our company is celebrating 24 years, and actually Ashley Ordin, who's with 7th Generation, we've worked with 7th Generation over the past 22 years. So we've been partners for a long time. And I encourage you to check out our website to learn a little bit more about our business. Thanks.
Great. Thank you and welcome. Glad to have you here. So let's jump over to Ashley. Hi, Ashley. Welcome.
Hi, thanks, Jennifer. Lovely to be here. I'm Ashley Ordin, Chief Impact Officer at 7th Generation. I have been here for 13 years, and I'm a proud partner in the business to have Tim Greiner and his team at Pure Strategies, as he said, working with us for over 20 years. So he's got a longer track record in the business than I do. I oversee our impact and advocacy strategies, so ensuring that we are making sustainable decisions in every decision we make, from raw material and ingredient sourcing to the end of life of our products. And I also oversee our advocacy work. So a lot of the issues that we care about and want to drive change on, like climate change or safer chemicals or transparency, require us to do work outside of our business. So advocacy, legislative reform, and public policy work is also in my remit. Glad to be here.
Great, thank you. We're glad to have you. Okay, and Trevor and Graham, you are both with Intellects. Trevor, could you introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, first of all, Jen, for having both of us. We really appreciate this opportunity and are excited to have the conversation today. So my name's Trevor. I'm a strategic development manager here at Intellects, which broadly means I'm responsible for defining and executing on a variety of growth vectors for Intellects. Intellects is a EHSQ, meaning environment, health, safety, and quality, as well as an ESG software provider. So our play in this space, right, the reason that we're on the call today, we've been doing environmental compliance as part of your EHSQ offering for 30 years now. It's actually Intellects' 30th birthday this year. Environmental compliance is in large part air emissions compliance, and air emissions are very akin to greenhouse gas emissions, right? So this is something that we've been doing for quite a long time. The audience and the stakeholder set is ever expanding right now when it comes to digging into your supply chain, when it comes to the emergence of ESG. But fundamentally, this is air emissions. This is something we know and love and have been executing for a long time and will execute long into the future. So that's Intellects. I'll throw it over to Graham now.
Hi, I'm Graham Freeman. I'm the officially a senior content manager, and that just means writing and editing. So I write a lot of Intellects' content about health and safety, ESG, but particularly ESG and quality, and doing a lot of writing about the supply chain. And one of the great things about my position is that I get to spend a lot of time reading what people are saying about things. So I get to spend a lot of time reading academic papers and analyst reports and news articles, and getting a really broad and deep sense of what's going on in the world of ESG and quality and supply chain. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. I am excited. This is a complex topic with a lot to talk about, and sounds like you guys are all the perfect group of people to talk about it. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and I am ready to jump in. So as I mentioned earlier, supply chain emissions often represent the majority of an organization's total emissions. So this means that your supplier's risk becomes your risk. So Tim, how about you get us started by talking a bit about the top challenges that you've seen that companies face when they're attempting to improve their supply chain sustainability, and particularly maybe touch on the cost increases. Does there have to be a separate line item for that? How does that all work?
Sure. Well, I like to think about these supply chain challenges with an acronym, which is TAC. It's traceability, alignment, and capacity. And I'll just go into each of those in a little bit of detail. So from a traceability standpoint, I think one of the biggest challenges is really understanding your own supply chain, right? How do we dive into not just our tier 1, our tier 2, but get even further in the supply chain where maybe the emission hotspots really lie, but yet they're further from the company or the brand, and they could also be ever changing. So that's just a huge challenge, because the deeper you go, the better the chance that the number of suppliers becomes almost geometric, right? Second major challenge is, once you know who those suppliers are, where they sit in your value chain, how do you align your interests on scope 3 with their interests as a business? How can you come together on raw material sourcing, the design, the use of renewable energy, whatever the intervention is, whatever's going to help drive that lowered greenhouse gas emission factor that you're looking for? How do you do that alignment? So that's T and A. Then C is just your own internal capacity. So I find this happens really frequently with companies, is that they've done some of the mapping, they've gotten to those key suppliers, they've begun those conversations, but then, business is business. There's lots of priorities in the business. So how do you develop that capacity to really engage with those suppliers over time? So I'll just cover off on like the way we see companies managing each of these challenges. So traceability and transparency, it's really about data and data management. So we see everything from surveys, right? And supply chain software that looks at who your suppliers are, questionnaires, that type of approach, to really integrating this traceability into strategic sourcing, so that when you're auditing for quality, you're auditing for other aspects in your supply chain, you're also doing that same auditing to those tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. So those are like two, they're not separate, they actually can come together quite well approaches. On the alignment side, here's where it's really critical to not go alone. Like if you can find other companies in your industry that can send the same signals to those suppliers, you can get alignment. If you also are using, instead of having your sustainability department engage with these tier down suppliers, it's super important that you have your procurement people and your supply chain people in those conversations. And it's even better if they can lead those conversations, because they're the ones with the intimate knowledge of the supplier. They're the ones negotiating price, delivery, quality. They should be negotiating sustainability for you. And then on the capacity side, this is where you've got to make the internal case in the business that this just can't be an afterthought, that you've got to have key partners in your procurement and your sourcing organization. They're going to help you engage your suppliers along the way. So that's just kind of an overview of some of the key challenges.
Great. And, as we talked about on, I think Thursday or Friday, a little bit about, so these challenges, they're significant, but they're not insurmountable, right? It's doable.
Yeah, certainly. And honestly, I find it takes 2 or 3 years from the time you start identifying the suppliers and those hotspots till you're beginning to have really good conversations. Maybe you've identified a better supplier of a raw material that a second tier supplier is sourcing for you. And now you've finally gotten the opportunity to engage with them and explain to them why this might be beneficial, not only for your company, but for their customers as well. They're not insurmountable at all.
Good, interesting. Anyone else have anything they want to add to that? No, shall we move on? Okay, so we talked about the challenges. We talked about the things that companies can do. Trevor and Graham, these two questions sort of go hand in hand. So Graham, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what organizations can do to work with their suppliers to mitigate the risk. And Trevor, also, maybe you can share what you see as best practices for getting your supplier base to agree to share some of that data that they otherwise either wouldn't be collecting or wouldn't be willing to share. How do you get them on board?
I'm happy to go first. One of the things that I enjoy writing about quite a lot with supply chains, of course, is the concept of risk. And you mentioned at the beginning that your supplier's risk becomes your risk. And the concept of what supply chain risk has seems to be changing every day. And it's certainly changed in the last 2 or 3 years. And the introduction of more and more measures about ESG really changed the nature of how we need to think about the concept of risk in the supply chain as a whole. One of the benefits, I suppose, that you have with emissions risk over some of the other risks that you might find is that at least emissions risk is something that is foreseeable, right? I mean, the SEC has been has been telegraphing that this move is coming for a long time. It's a different kind of risk than many of the other kinds of risks that we're seeing in the supply chain, right? I mean, COVID-19 snuck up fairly quickly. The war in Ukraine snuck up fairly quickly. So it's not as though emissions risk is something that we need to react to on the fly, right? It's something that we have that time to prepare for. And as mentioned previously, it's doable, right? And in large part, it's doable because you can see it coming, and we know what it's about to happen. And yet the reality is that emissions risk is just one of the many ways in which we're having to rethink the entire concept of how risk applies to the supply chain. And one of those risks is not just emissions, but also thinking about how we have to think about risks that are coming, decades into the future. That's one of the things about ESG. The way it changes the supply chain risk is how far into the future we really need to think about where some of these risks are coming from. So we need to think preemptively about risk in the supply chain, anticipate things. And like I said, the benefit of emissions risk is that regulators and legislators tend to tell us those things are coming. And so we have the opportunity to figure those things out. But there are difficulties there. And for example, one of the things that we are trying to do, many people are trying to do with the supply chain now, is develop resiliency for the supply chain, right? I mean, many people had difficulties with suppliers falling in and out during COVID, suppliers who couldn't meet demand. And so part of the strategy for developing supply chain resiliency is to develop a network, to look elsewhere for other suppliers that might be able to fill in the gaps. But the problem with that is that every time you do that, it requires more due diligence. Due diligence is it's effort. It requires work, and it can be difficult. And the bigger your network of suppliers, the more due diligence you're really going to have to do to manage that sort of thing. And that requires a very rigorous approach to due diligence. And again, it's very fortunate that all of these things are things that can be managed. They can be managed through the application of risk frameworks that already exist. Lots of ESG risk frameworks that allow us to change the way we've thought about supply chain risk in the past to the way we're going to have to think about supply chain risk now and in the future, of which emissions is one of the most significant, but also we can learn to think better about emissions risk along the supply chain, along with the way we think about all of these other new and exciting black swan risks that we hadn't thought about up until recently.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Graham. And Trevor, I will repeat the question. So we were talking about, whether you can share some best practices for getting your suppliers on board, getting them to share data. If they push back, how do you handle that?
Yeah, sure. So Graham's right. There's, supply chain risk is an ever evolving space, and it's evolving quite quickly right now. But managing that risk means measuring the risk. So that's what it comes down to. And as Tim mentioned, these things have to make business sense for your supply base. You can't simply reach into your, chest of 1,000, 2,000, 20,000 suppliers if you're a multinational enterprise and just demand data. That's not going to work, because for your suppliers, you need to make sure, and when we talk about making business sense, right, it needs to be something that's not super time consuming, not super costly. You can't introduce a massive hurdle into the way they do business simply to appease your voluntary, things that you're doing, or sometimes, and Graham highlighted the SEC there, sometimes things now the government may be asking you to do, at least here in the US. So there's many best practices. I'll cover a couple. One, Tim also alluded to this, you can apply pressure in a sense from a grouping of your peers, meaning, hey, I need this data from you, this is why I need it, but I'm not the only one that's going to need it. For you to stay in business, for you to be growing the folks that you serve as a supplier, it's going to make sense for you to have this data available. I'm asking for it now. People are going to be asking for it in the future. This is going to become table stakes just to do business on a global scale. So with that in mind, I want you to know that I'm going to be requesting this data from you. I need access to it at this cadence, at this level of granularity, et cetera. Two, you can help them understand how to best do that. Okay, so obviously the maturity of businesses varies widely across the globe. Some folks may actually have this data ready for you. Some people may have never thought to measure this data at all. So especially when you're talking to a business that may not be mature in the way they collect data, you can introduce them to tools like a software. You can introduce them to the questionnaire approach. You can introduce them to a consulting firm that can help them. You, again, want to make this make sense for them, which will in turn make sense for you. And that may very well mean helping them help you. And we have tons of people on the call today that can speak to that. Obviously, this is a booming industry, really. It's a rising tide, meaning there's going to be a lot of solution providers out there that are ready to solve this fairly massive problem. I mean, we're asking for people to measure Scope 3 emissions, which are incredibly difficult to manage to a level that's you can truly infer and improve on, right? So it's making the supplier know that this is good business sense for them. It's making the supplier know that this does not have to be a massive hurdle that they need to jump, that there are things that you can do to help. And the third one, the last one I'll touch on here, is just you want to make it known that, hey, you're supplying this data. This is going to help us maintain our relationship with you. Graham mentioned that if one supplier is not giving what you want, you'll go to another supplier. And if a large company needs to disclose this and one supplier isn't, it makes a pretty easy business case for doing your DD and finding another supplier, right? So not only are you going to be able to help me and my peers if you do this because I need to disclose, this is quickly becoming somewhat of an existential thing for these tier 2, tier 3, whatever suppliers that need to have this data. This is good business. I'm asking for it. They're asking for it. If you don't have it, we will go somewhere that does, because we cannot have this gap in what we report. So it really comes back to Tim's point, though. It's got to make business sense, help them understand why it makes business sense, and help them execute it.
Right. Got it. Thank you. So that kind of ties in with oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sandy.
Can I just come back one point just to make it a bit of a debate? There are some great points there, but there's one about the risk, which I think stood out, right? So we are collecting a lot of information, and I think we'd all agree that the risk, the long-term risk, the big macro aspects of the emissions and the climate change, I think we know what's going to be happening. But I think there's a lot of debate still about translating that, and what's the impact on my business, certainly over the next 5 years, right? So that's where I think the risk is perhaps not as certain as a business would like it to be able to model it about what should they do with the next 5 years. So I think I just wanted to kind of put that point in there in terms of, we're seeing a lot of, there's a lot of debate. We've seen kind of a recent issue with the HSBC ESG advisor that was coming up about commentary about ESG disclosures and that impact of risk. And I think businesses are still struggling with the size of their GHG impact and then the impact that will have on the business within the short term.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, Ashley.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on one of the last points. While we're all sustainability practitioners here and can get the business case, I think, very easily, that's not always the case with our suppliers. And we have often faced challenges getting this data. So I can't underscore the importance of incentives for your suppliers in completing this information and providing this information enough. And then also celebrating these successes, recognizing when you get this data and lifting those suppliers up and using them as a model for other suppliers to encourage them to get on board and get involved.
Thanks, Ashley. That's an interesting point you brought up about incentives, and I'd love you to touch on that. I'm going to circle back with you in just a minute, but maybe that's one of the points that you can expound upon a little bit. But Sandy, I wanted to touch base with you to talk about a little more. Trevor was talking about measuring, success. And I know you and I had touched base about benchmarking. When companies are beginning to do this, they're engaging with their suppliers. That's one thing, but how do they benchmark where they started, where they're getting to? What's that process like?
So if we're looking into Scope 3, some of the areas are easier to benchmark than others, right? So Scope 3 is a large number of diverse categories, and some of them are easy and some of them are more complicated. I think if we look at some of the more complicated ones, the kind of purchase goods and services, the use of sold products at the end of life, I think there's some good benchmark data out there. So what we want to do is find out what good, bad, and ugly looks like and provide that information to the value chain. And as Ashley says, that can help start a conversation. It can start to incentivize and place people place a supplier in the context of where they are, whether they're going to be looking good, or whether they're on kind of in the lower quartile looking bad in terms of their GHG performance. We would point people to ranges of data sets, but certainly for purchase goods and services, there is a lot of LCA process-based data out there on the marketplace. It gives you a quick and easy snapshot into that supply chain in order for you to say, okay, if I'm buying a particular widget or a certain amount of material, the carbon footprint, what should it be? My supplier is providing it for 10 kilograms per widget. Is that good or bad? If you go into the LCA databases, the process-based databases, you can find a lot of good information that can give you a good start about, actually, that's really good. You want to be encouraging that supplier. You want to be buying more from that supplier. Or actually, that's not particularly great. And there's lots of databases out there. We provide one in Gabi, but there's lots of other ones out there. I think it's a good source of information. The other benchmark is that benchmark from the supplier. So if you go out to the supplier, you can kind of have good, it's a rather grand word, but gamification of the supply chain. So you're going out asking for information of the supplier. As soon as you put a dashboard on that supply chain, still using anonymized data, and you start showing a supplier to say, well, we're buying this material from different suppliers in different locations, and we're in an anonymized fashion showing you some numbers, that really changes behavior straight away, because no one wants to be at the bottom of that. So they will suddenly, if they started to see that, they're going to go straight back to their sustainability teams and say, okay, look, the carbon footprint of what we're selling to this manufacturer is not good enough. I've seen the data, we have to act. And now here is a new benchmark, and that can go into the eco-design process. So I think there's two good ways if you can get benchmark data. One, directly from the suppliers and showing and providing transparency of that data. And the other is using kind of LCA process-based content to kind of give you some quick wins when you don't have access to the suppliers.
Those are some interesting points. Thank you, Sandy. Yeah, Tim, did you have?
I just wanted to build on something Sandy said about the process-based LCA data. So just an example of this, for 7th generation, we were looking at a core ingredient that is pretty important to their Scope 3 carbon footprint. And looking at that regional data, we saw that the suppliers in China had by far the highest emissions associated with the ingredient. Suppliers in Europe were 60% lower per kilogram. Suppliers in North America, 40% lower. So just by that simple analysis, and then by doing some investigation into the supply chain and figuring out, well, where were the suppliers sourcing this information? It was an open sourced item and there was nothing required in the 7th gen specification around where you got this ingredient. It's a commodity. It's undifferentiated by these different regions. 7th gen was able to ask suppliers to shift away from those more carbon intensive suppliers and towards those suppliers in those regions that had better carbon efficiency. So just a simple example there. And again, it provides impetus for all parts, like that gamification thing you were mentioning, Sandy, as well, right? Like once those commodity suppliers realize where they sit, that also could motivate them to change their behavior.
Yeah. Hi, Ashley.
Thanks. I just wanted to build on that because what Tim is describing was a huge win for 7th generation. And we actually were able to execute against that intervention within a year's time. And while that might sound, 12 months like a long time, it actually was rather quick when you think about changing where your key ingredient is coming from. And so getting back to the conversation or the point around incentives, what was critical for us actually was not incentivizing the suppliers, but incentivizing our internal team. So incentivizing our folks on the procurement team to go out and pursue this. So we set at 7th Generation an annual incentive plan against sustainability targets. And we decided as a sustainability team that this was going to be such a significant contribution to our emissions in that year that we were going to set this as an organizational target. The procurement team got excited about it and pursued it within a year's time, and the whole organization's emissions were reduced and everyone benefited with their end of year bonus.
Wow. Yeah, it's amazing what you can do with incentivizing internally. I thought you had been speaking externally, but that's a great example. And that leads me to my next question, which really is just, how much of this sounds familiar to you, Ashley, in terms of 7th Generation's work with their suppliers, and maybe you can give some initiatives that you've done, some examples, what's worked, maybe a couple of things that haven't worked.
So yeah, so incentives, not only do we use internally, but we also use incentives with our supply base. So let me step back and where we actually get the framework and the program to drive those incentives. We set an annual carbon tax against our scope 1 through 3 emissions minus consumer use against a per dollar metric ton. We put that money aside at the beginning of the year, and then we use that to pursue the interventions that we've identified are going to help reduce our overall emissions. So what is important to us right now, outside of the key decisions that we're making around materials and ingredients, are how actually our products are being manufactured and where they're being manufactured as it relates to the energy that's being consumed in those facilities, mostly across North America. So we're able to drive our suppliers to procure clean, renewable energy in place of coal, which is actually where we do have significant suppliers utilizing on their energy grid, based upon this fund that we set out at the beginning of the year. So we help not only with, starting out with a survey of these suppliers to better understand their energy profile, but then bringing in a partner who can help develop that business case, can help convince our suppliers that this is an opportunity, not only for them to meet an expectation that's set by 7th Generation, but also for a business benefit. We pay for that consultant to work with our suppliers for the very first year, get them off the ground, and then following years, they're responsible for pursuing that independently. So this does sound familiar, and incentives can play a key role not only internally, but also externally. And setting aside funds based upon our emission footprint has been the critical vehicle for getting that work off the ground.
Great, those are some good examples. I want to shift a little. Well, before I shift, does anyone else have anything they want to add to that?
I'll just add in the green power program that Ashley was just describing, 7th Gen is engaging not only with tier 1, but also critical tier 2 suppliers that have high electricity related greenhouse gas emissions. So that's fairly novel. And this use of renewable energy as I like to think of it as an entree point into a broader conversation with the business. It's in particular when it's brought on by an important customer like 7th Generation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So shifting just a bit, we're talking about improving emissions with our suppliers, but another, potentially enormous challenge is that of reporting. So Sandy, I'm wondering if you can chat with us a bit about your thoughts on how to increase the quality of scope 3 reporting.
So quality of scope 3 reporting is probably one of my biggest bugbears. I think it's improving rapidly. So since I've come back from COVID, the conversation seems to have changed over the past 6 months. But if I go back 2 or 3 years, I think it was really quite poor. So where scope 3 is supposed to be for a lot of companies, not all, 70% plus of their carbon footprint, which is why we're having the conversation today. A lot of that is in purchased goods and services, use of sold products, and life in those categories. Those are the ones that I think organizations are just going into. And the GHG protocol, the standard that we all go to, is very old. It probably needs updating. It definitely needs updating. And it has a hierarchy of quality data. And it starts with supplier-specific data, which is great. And we're seeing traction there. It comes down to this process LCA-based data. But it starts with this spend-based data. Spend-based data is great for screening in Scope 3, finding out which categories you should be going for. Within your purchased goods and services, you have 40,000 suppliers. Your team, I think that word capacity, Tim, and your TAC, they don't have the capacity to do the 40,000, so they've got to start somewhere. It's okay to start with that 100, but don't use that spend-based data to then go and do your calculation. LCA process-based data is available. It's not massively difficult to get hold of. It's not commercially unreasonable to get hold of, considering we're talking about 70% of your carbon footprint. To me, Scope 3 is not a significant challenge. There is a cost element in terms of we need some more budgets coming into it, but we need to improve the quality. We should not be allowing secondary data to be used in these calculations for the most material part of an organization's greenhouse gas, not secondary, spend-based data. If we go to the GHG protocol, I'd also like to see some better categorizations of databases. So, this is the underlying number. So we get the good data from procurement. We know that we buy 1,000 pineapples, right? That's pretty accurate. That's good quality data. But then we multiply it by something. We multiply it by emission factor. And the standards don't say you have to multiply it by a good quality emission factor. It just says you have to multiply it by an emission factor, right? So given how significant it is, we have to do some work to improve the databases. We have to get them to be updated every year, which some of them are. They have to be third-party verified. And we need some differentiation in terms of what is a good database and what is an old database. So if you went onto the GHG protocol website now, you would see databases which are over 20 years old, and you would see databases which are updated every year. And if you were just new to this, how would you know what is good and what is bad? Because they're all on the GHG protocol website. They all have that brand and backing. So I think there needs to be a lot of work there to improve that base underlying emission factor data set. So we have ours, Gabby, which we provide, been working over the past 30 years. We have 150 people coming up with emission factors. We're very grateful to our customer base who allow in an anonymized way for that data to go into that database. There are other sectors that are doing data, Plastics Europe, we have Textile Exchange, we have cost initiatives, we have databases in coffee. So there's lots and lots of rich, good quality databases out there, but still there are multinational businesses that are doing their GHG calculation using really, really poor quality data. And we'd like us to raise that bar and ultimately getting everyone to that supply chain or that supplier specific emission factor over time.
Right. I didn't realize some of that. That's interesting about the databases that are being built in the different industries or for different products. So it sounded like at the beginning of what you were saying is that it really is improving quickly.
It's getting better. I think we're getting a jump. I think more organizations are happy to work with their supply chain. So like before COVID, everyone was using secondary databases to calculate their Scope 3. Most people weren't doing purchased goods and services. They were just doing business travel. So there's a lot more work. So the conversation now is moving up to going out to the supply chain, asking for the carbon footprint of their suppliers, asking for the carbon footprint of the products they provide. Maybe not working with all of their suppliers, but starting to work with 100 to 500 suppliers. Mm-hmm. There are some examples like BASF where they're looking to do 40,000. So there's some real good leadership there. But I think it's nice to see people are moving away from even the secondary databases and going directly and go and get that specific carbon footprint of the material or the product that you're actually buying and bringing into your organization.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Tim, did you have a follow-up comment to that?
Yeah, I think Sandy's spot on here. And just maybe some definitions. So secondary data is like industry average data for an emission factor. And then primary data would be data directly from your supplier, your supply chain. And then the spend-based method, takes a little longer to describe it. It's basically economic input-output information that looks at assigning pollution or greenhouse gas emissions across different sectors of the economy. And it's based upon the dollars you spend purchasing whatever the input is, a service or an ingredient. And going back to what Graham was talking about, risk earlier, like think about the risk of building your emissions inventory and your decisions around greenhouse gases on a spend basis, which we know is only there for estimating. It's not really going to help you hone in on not only really where your emission hotspots are, it'll do a decent job, but not a great job, but then also really measuring your improvement and be able to communicate that over time, which, as we understand here in the US, could be actually part of a requirement of the SEC. So yeah, this need for better data and using good qualified secondary data like what Sphera sells and what other companies also provide is super important.
Yeah, and I want to just add to that too. When we think about the regulatory requirements coming, and we've talked a lot about in the last 10 minutes about what the different approaches to establishing this data from your supply chain, right? Once these rules across the globe have time to kind of iron themselves out, for example, the SEC is in the comment period right now. So they're all kind of trying to figure out exactly what they're going to look like, let's say 5 years from now. I don't have the answer, but I'm just saying everyone should be cognizant of the fact that we need to understand what quality of data is actually going to appease the regulator. So in some cases, it may be hyper granular data for 40% of your supply chain, and that's good enough to infer what's going on with the other 60%. And it's like a bit of a financial audit in that sense, where they take a really close look at some things to make sure you're doing it right. In other cases, it may be a decent estimate for 100% of your supply chain, and that's good enough to appease whatever rule you have to abide by in whatever geography you're operating in. So I think it's just, we'll all be watching this, I'm sure, on the call, but it's important for everyone that has an interest in this to understand when everything shakes out, what is actually required, what is the level of data, how should you be conducting these assessments, what emission factors should you be using, because that ball is still up in the air, and we need to see where exactly it lands so businesses know how to best proceed, because there's going to be leaders in the space, there's going to be laggards, there's going to be people that do the bare minimum of what they need to do to comply. So it behooves everyone to understand what that all looks like.
Okay, great. Thanks, Trevor. I'd like to go back to Tim and Ashley. So we've talked a lot about the challenges, the strategies, how this can work, what's not working. I'd love to know, so 7th generation and Pure Strategies have worked together for quite a while, as you said. What have you come across that's either particularly interesting or maybe surprising that can help other organizations manage their own supply chains?
Maybe I'll start, Ashley. All right, so this goes back a little bit, but maybe 10 years ago, 7th Gen had a Supplier Summit on sustainability. And they actually invited the CEOs of all their major suppliers to come. And most of those companies actually sent their CEOs. At that kickoff, the CEO at the time, Jeffrey Hollander, talked about the importance of sustainability to the planet, to the business relationships with these CEOs. And then he had a couple of companies stand up and kind of present on some of the work they were doing. And I'll never forget, one of the strategic suppliers of 7th Gen, the CEO stood up and said, I'm going to tell you all right here and today, we don't have a comprehensive program in our company, but we're going to build one. And that CEO did build. They have, I think in their industry, they're recognized as the leading company relative to sustainability, carbon, packaging, you name it, in that industry. And it was just an example in my mind of like this soft power the company used. And we've seen this also at Walmart, where Walmart does a similar thing, bringing their suppliers together and having leadership promote the leading suppliers. So anyway, it was a fun meeting that harkens back to, I think, 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's a great story. Ashley, anything to add there?
Going to say back when we could have meetings in person, Tim.
Yeah.
Yes, here in Burlington, Vermont. Oh, what I would add is what has been incredibly valuable in our partnership is how Tim's team and what we have learned over time, packaging a lot of the data that we have pulled from our suppliers into strong stories and compelling calls to action for our people internally. So while I might be, or my team might be in the sustainability work day to day, we have to remember that those that we're partnering with across the organization have a lot of other priorities that they are pursuing. And so really taking the data, simplifying it, making it clear and connected to their functions, and then having a very simple call to action to have them engage with us in our sustainability work has been really tremendous and important.
Great, thank you. So Graham, I want to switch the conversation back to you. You had mentioned I believe in your introduction, you had talked about quality. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on when it comes to these topics. How can organizations find support for ESG in their quality departments?
Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation at this point, and especially the points about interacting with suppliers, and especially suppliers who might not, be up to speed with the sorts of things that you need and can't supply the right kind of data that you need. But one of the things that I'm really interested in as well is finding common languages with all kinds of suppliers along the supply chain and taking advantage of frameworks and ways of thinking about things that already exist. And quality management is one of those places where it is largely about process efficiency. It can be an excellent way not only of building bridges between you and your suppliers and finding a common language with them, helping to get them into a mindset and a framework of seeing things in that kind of an efficiency way, and looking at, there are all sorts of standards like ISO 9001 and the Baldrige framework and EFQM, all of which have always been designed to create those process efficiencies that can they're about reducing waste, really. They're about reducing inefficiencies. They're about reducing rework. They're about finding ways of creating process efficiencies that can change the way you manufacture your products in such a way as to reduce the emissions that you're making in the first place. And so I've always been very interested in seeing those connections between things like Baldrige and the impact that can have on the way we think about emissions and the common language that can give us along the supply chain.
So thank you, Graham. That brings me to another question for Trevor, which is, with all of this going on within an organization at once, how does a business strike a balance between sustainability and all the other factors that make a good supply chain? I mean,
yeah,
obviously,
of course,
sustainability can't be the only thing you're thinking about.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to just follow up on Graham's point, and then I'll move on to this question. That's so important because when we think about sustainability, whether it's within your own four walls or within your supply chain, there are many things you can do that are very sustainability or scope 3 focused, different initiatives you can make, reduce your carbon intensity, et cetera. But, as an EHS software company that's, again, been around for 30 years, I've been thinking about this a long time, and we've seen sustainability honestly come and go in waves of interest and focus. And I think everyone would agree that a truly mature sustainability program is much more of a sustainability culture. It's not so much having the sustainability police walk around and tell you to do this or change that. It's thinking about sustainability in every decision you make, whether it be your energy usage, whether it be your quality practices. It's making sure that it is simply embedded across the business. So of course, there's going to be specific levers you can pull. But you, in theory, if you're very mature in this, should be operating in a way with a nod to sustainability with everything you do. And that's true for safety. It's really true for anything. If you really want it to be part of your culture, it needs to be part of your bones. So I think that's really important. And quality is a fantastic example of how focusing on something like quality actually has a lot of beneficial effects to sustainability. That's not the only example, but that's a great example. So just wanted to follow up there. Now thinking about, again, sustainability can't be the only thing you're thinking about. And that's so true. We've talked today a lot about figuring out the scope 3 emissions from your supply chain. And that's important. There's stakeholders asking for you to disclose that. What Sandy was talking about earlier in terms of actual risk when people are thinking about this from an investment perspective, because that's maybe the big driver of ESG, is bringing it in as another set of risks to understand when allocating your capital, these kind of non-financial, non-traditional risks. Another risk could be not just the carbon that you're putting into the air, but what is all that carbon and what is climate change going to do to your supply chain? And this probably isn't something that has maybe a 5-year time horizon or even a 10-year time horizon, but looking out 20, 30 years, your supply chain could look drastically different depending on what shakes out with climate change and what the world looks like then. And that's not just from it's hot here and the sea level's risen here. That's from a immigration and emigration perspective. That's from a health of the economy perspective. It's from crop output. There's so much risk that you need to consider. Now, this is all climate change related risk, not to mention the good old fashioned, can I get my inventory when I need it, how much I need it, all these ideas of what an efficient supply chain looks like. So of course you need to put first and foremost a viable supply chain forward that can meet the demands of your customers. Beyond that, you certainly need to start thinking more about sustainability, about scope 3, about all these things, because that will make a healthy supply chain in the future. But you need to balance what good business from a cost benefit perspective looks like and good business from a sustainability perspective. The bottom line is there's a lot of mouths to feed. There's a lot of stakeholders that want a lot of very different things out of your business, and your supply chain will want to know different things. So just make sure you have a really good understanding of the materiality of these risks, really what stakeholders are maybe more important than others, what they're asking for, not only from a data perspective, but from a delivery perspective, and make sure that you have a good current understanding of the priorities and that you can orient your business as such. So you have a healthy supply chain today and you have a healthy supply chain in 20 years. Those supply chains may be very different, but you want to make sure it's healthy at the current time. So you need to just think about all the needs, think about all the stakeholders, think about all the different levers to pull and figure out the right combination, right? That's why this is a booming industry, because people are looking for experts that can do just that.
Right. Yeah, that's a lot of good advice, and it is it just reminds me again of what a broad topic this is and how much there is to do.
Incredibly broad.
Right. Yeah, and I just write about it and read about it. You guys are the ones actually doing the work, so I think it's wonderful, and I love hearing all of your solutions. So we're almost out of time, but one of the things I'd love to touch on is what are your thoughts on what a company should be looking for in a partner to help them do this stuff? I imagine that unless you have a pretty non-complex supply chain, it's helpful to work with a partner who can help you. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on when you're looking for a tech-enabled solution to help you solve these problems. What are you looking for? And maybe Ashley, you can touch on how that partnership works. So Sandy, do you want to start us off with that?
Thanks, Jennifer. It's definitely true to tackle scope 3 and to tackle this growing complexity that people have been talking about, you're going to need a digital approach to it. So I've seen some wonderful Excel spreadsheets. I'm sure the rest of the panel have seen them as well, and they've done a wonderful job. And potentially, if you scope 1, scope 2, you can maybe manage that with just Excel. But when we bring in the complexity of scope 3 and all those different categories, I think you're going to definitely need a digital approach. So I think that's part of the journey people have to accept. High quality data, high quality content. I think I mentioned that. That's always there. And then the ability to scale. So when we start talking about the suppliers, we've talked about, we're seeing, 100 suppliers, 500 suppliers, people making that entry point. And then we've got people like BSF at the 40,000 suppliers. I think you've got to know that software approach can scale because 40,000 suppliers providing data is a lot of complexity. And then when you bring in that digital approach and when you're scaled up, you've also then got to pivot back to the partnership, the services approach, right? Because if you've got 40,000 suppliers, that's a lot of questions that those 40,000 suppliers are going to be asking. So how are you going to put the services wrap and the consulting wrap around that to support digital approach as we start to get into these larger numbers?
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. Those sound like really good points. Let's see, Tim, how about you? Thoughts on the question?
Yeah, so it's a really tough nut to crack. Sandy mentioned beautiful spreadsheets, but spreadsheets have their limitations. So I think what we find is if you can integrate it into the company's existing tools, that's really helpful because those are the tools that different functions in the business are already using. The problem tends to be sustainability has a low priority relative to other IT needs in the business. So if it's a SAP or other ERP tool or other like corporate tool, you've got to like get on the list and try to get up to that priority level where they can build in your requirements into that system. So I think, that's something that we're always looking for is how can we build into the company's existing system, or how can we seamlessly, if possible, create enough data that we can then put that back in a dashboard format to the people that need to see it. And it's not just the sustainability people. We've been talking about procurement and supply chain. So I think, those are two of the main issues. There are a whole number of tech platforms out there. I encourage companies to do, we don't sell software, we're a service company. If you're going to do software, do an RFP, really kick the tires, talk to other customers, and certainly really understand the difference between what's actually in the platform today and what's being promised for the future. And also understand what it's going to take for you to internally bring all your data into that system and connect to it. Because that's where I find the breakdowns happen the most is it's a great platform, but we've got data islands and we want to make them merge together if we can. And again, that takes not only a great vendor, but it takes internal resources in your company to do that.
Got it.
Those are some great points, and that's so true. A lot of the data that people are seeking right now exists in one of your platforms. Sandy and I both work for EHS software companies. There's a lot of EHS and ESG data that already exists in those departments. There's supply chain data in your ERP software. There's some, ESG is broad, as we mentioned. There's a lot of that social data in your human capital software. It all exists, and you need to figure out where it is, where the gaps are, and how to get it out. When you're looking for a technology solution, maybe you do want a dedicated tool. You want to understand what that company has done for companies like yours. So you're going to want to look at industry experience. You want to understand, will this company be basically partnering with me to build their solution alongside my needs, which isn't always a bad approach, by the way. Sometimes that can be really good and it can lead to a nice tool, but that's going to bring a different set of challenges, maybe a different time frame. Maybe they have a bunch of clients in the space. Maybe they have a amazing emission factor library or product LCA database that's basically plug and play for what I need. So there's a lot of companies out there. We've talked a lot about the interest in this. That's why we're on the call today. So there's a lot more popping up every single day. So you definitely need to do your due diligence and understand what this company can bring to me and sometimes what I can bring to this company. It's absolutely a partnership. And then there's going to be a services element involved. So maybe you're working with a software company and then you're working with a company like Pure Strategies also, or maybe that software company has services there, some subject matter expertise where they can help you along. So there's a lot of different ways to slice this cake. You as a shopper, as an organization, need to understand what's going to be the best fit for you. And that also means being honest with yourself. Be honest with your maturity levels, with your goals, what you ultimately want to get out of this. You need to know what success looks like, and you need to have a time frame before you start this journey, or else you'll be like a ship without a sail. You'll just be floating around. You need to understand where you're going and understand what tool you want to get there, because these are our software companies. We're just tools. We are tools. We are means to an end. So you need to make sure you have the right tool for the job that you, your organization, want to accomplish.
Great, Trevor, those were good specific examples. I appreciate that. Graham, do you have anything to add on to what Trevor had said?
I mean, this is all great information. I think the other thing I would say, and of course at the beginning we heard about spreadsheets, and it's almost obligatory, I think, when we're talking about this, to mention that there will certainly be lots of places out there that are still using spreadsheets, and how that's going to be inadequate as we move forward. I mean, the good thing about the fact that people are using spreadsheets is the fact that they are doing it, and that puts them in a good headspace to be thinking about this sort of thing. And the only other thing I guess I would add is that in addition to spreadsheets, the other important thing to think about when looking for a vendor is making sure that this is a tool that everybody who needs to use it is going to use it. It's not difficult to tell your IT department to build a complex tool that manages complexity that is difficult to use. And that nobody wants to use, and data doesn't end up going into it. So one of the really important things about managing the complexity of supply chain emissions is making sure that the way that people who actually do the job every day interface with it is pleasant, is easy to use. It's easy to make complexity complex. It's difficult to make complexity easy to interact with, and that's a really important element of looking for a software solution to manage this complexity. Otherwise, the work doesn't happen. That doesn't need to get done, and no matter how much you spend on it or all the bells and whistles it has, if nobody's using the tool, then it's not doing anyone any good.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sandy, did I see you? Did you have something to add to that?
Nope.
No. Okay. And I was going to, there you are. Ashley, thoughts on that, the final question? Working with a partner, choosing a partner.
Frozen at the wrong time.
Yeah, I think you're frozen. No. Okay, well, maybe she will dial in as I'm saying thank you to all of you. That was really wonderful information. And there you are. Hi. Yeah, so you froze as you were starting to weigh in on the final question. Oh, shoot. That looks like it's not going to happen for her. All right. Well, I will have Ashley weigh in. And are you there? Is it going to work?
I am here.
Okay.
I'm not sure how it will be. Honestly, Jennifer, I was just saying that the points have been very well made, and I would agree that it's been the experience that 7th Generation has had. It's been so.
Okay.
Nothing more to add.
Perfect. Sounds good. Well, I'm glad you were back for our closing, because I really want to say thank you guys all. That was such great information, and I know our viewers will find it super helpful. So, and that's all the time we have. So thanks again to our guests today, and we appreciate your sharing your expertise. And to our audience, we appreciate you joining us. Thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.